Hi, mentalists. So our topic for today is mental causation, and I've asked you to read chapter 7 of Jaegwon Kim's Philosophy of Mind, third edition. And I would just like to say a little something about Professor Kim. He was actually my philosophy of mind professor when I was in college. And unfortunately for all of us, he passed away last year around this time in November. And I just wanted to say a word to remember him and to thank him for being such a wonderful teacher. He's one of the primary people that inspired me to stay in philosophy. He was always very supportive and encouraging, and I can speak for many people when I say we miss him very much. And his influence in philosophy of mind was very notable, and in particular on this topic. So I'm very honored to get to talk to you today about his work on mental causation. So on the topic of mental causation, what is it relevant to, and what is it, and what does it connect to, and what does this have to do with functionalism, which we were talking about last week? So mental causation is relevant to general questions of human agency in the world. So agency is our ability to act on the basis of reasons. It's the thing that differentiates us as sentient beings from non-sentient, purely or merely behaving beings or just happenings in the world. It seems to us that acting on the basis of reasons, says Professor Kim, requires having cognitive and motivational states, like beliefs and desires, that influence our behavior. An agent is someone with the capacity to perform actions for reasons. And actions are different from mere happenings. They are things that we do, not that we are passive about. This implies that we have a kind of control over our actions. And the other thing that's important here is this idea of reasons and what reasons are. One theory is that reasons explain actions by being the causes of actions. So that's Donald Davidson's view, and we'll talk a little bit about Davidson in a moment. So this picture of agency and of actions and agents suggests that agency is possible only if mental causation is possible. How do we get there? Well, if doing things on the basis of reasons is something that agents do, and reasons come from cognitive and motivational states like beliefs and desires, then the only way that I am able to act is if, because I have some notion of what I am doing the action for, the reason. I have some motivation or I have some rationale. So if I were to go downstairs to the kitchen to get a glass of water, I would explain that by saying, well, I went to the kitchen because I wanted a glass of water and because I believed that if I went to the kitchen that I would find water in the kitchen, right? If we were to forget one of those two things, or not have one of those two things in our minds, like if we were to believe that there was water in the kitchen, but we didn't want to go to the kitchen, we probably wouldn't end up going to the kitchen and getting a glass of water. Or if we wanted a glass of water, but we didn't believe that going to the kitchen was a way to get it, we wouldn't go to the kitchen to get a glass of water. So, really, on this theory of agency, the thing that explains why I go to the kitchen to get a glass of water is that I believe that there's water in the kitchen and that I want to get water. So, cognitive and motivational states like those beliefs and desires not only influence our behavior, but actually explain our behavior, and they are the reason for our behavior. That view turns out to be impossible if we don't think that mental kinds like beliefs or desires, wants and wishes, thoughts and hopes and dreams, right? If those sorts of things can't influence our behavior because mental things are different from physical things, then we're in trouble. The entire notion of agency is in trouble. The entire notion that what we decide is the reason why we do things is in trouble. The only explanation that would be left, if our mental states don't actually influence physical actions, would be, only physical actions influence physical actions, and agency has no part to play in the world. So forget even about the free will question. We don't even enter into a position where free will would be relevant, because at no point are my decision-making abilities that I think that I have even entering into the explanation of an action. So epiphenomenalism is the view that although mental events are caused by physical events, mental events do not themselves cause any physical events.
Kim accuses Donald Davidson of being an epiphenomenalist on the basis that Donald Davidson doesn't think that there are psychophysical laws linking physical events to psychological events or vice versa. We won't go into this in the lecture today, but there is a passage on this in your notes, so please check those out if you would like more information.
If epiphenomenalism is true, according to some philosophers, such as Samuel Alexander, the mind has no work to do, and hence is entirely useless. Causal powers and being real go hand in hand, suggests Kim. So if epiphenomenalism is true, why even talk about philosophy of mind, basically? So it is very important to show how it is and whether it is the case that mental events can influence physical events. Now, you might remember our discussion about Elizabeth of Bohemia way back at the beginning of the semester. Elizabeth saw this problem for dualism. She was worried about if we said that mental events, mental substances, were entirely different kinds of things ontologically from physical events or objects or substances, then she was concerned that they wouldn't be able to influence each other at all. And this same problem would arise where we wouldn't be able to explain why it seems to us like things that we decide to do, things that we believe, things that we desire, influence the things that we actually do in the world. So that's what we might call the traditional problem of interaction. According to the traditional problem, mental substances are essentially thinking and unextended in space, and physical substances are extended and essentially extended, unthinking things. They're not, going on up there. And Princess Elizabeth was worried that Cartesian minds seem unable to cause physical events because they don't exist in space, they have no chemical composition, they carry no electrical charge, they're not the subject to forces of gravity or magnetism. So how does that causation thing happen if mental substances have no there, like they don't have any extension in space? Descartes' answer was to say that psychophysical interaction must be taken as a primitive, and it can't be understood on the model of physical causation. So physical to physical causation, which explains chemical causation, electrical causation, all these other different types of forces like gravity and magnetism, none of that is the right analogy, Descartes thinks, for mental to physical causation. It's just a very different kind of thing. It's a primitive. The philosopher Karen Bennett suggests that Elizabeth is assuming a kind of process view of causation, according to which cause and effect must be linked by some sort of process of production or generation or something like that. And Bennett points out that there are other views available for causation that don't trouble Cartesian interaction as much. Views like Humane regularity theory, named after philosopher David Hume, according to which causation is just a matter of constant conjunction. So this event C causes this event E just in case events of the type C reliably are followed by events of the type E. So it's just a kind of necessary connection that they have because they're constantly conjoined. That's the way Hume would have said. So if this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens all the time, then you can say that there's a regularity there. And that's a sort of way of talking about causation where it doesn't matter what sort of thing follows, from the first sort of thing. It doesn't matter whether one is mental or physical, it's just constant conjunction. So on a Humean regularity theory view, it seems like Elizabeth's concern about interactionism isn't as strong. There's also a modern way of thinking about causation, which is not definitive. People argue about what causation is all the time. This other view is called counterfactual dependence. According to counterfactual dependence, C causes E just in case E would not have occurred, wouldn't have happened if C hadn't occurred. So we call this a counterfactual because it's an if-then, right, relationship where if one thing had not happened, the other one would had not happened either. And that's how we understand causation. And that counterfactual dependence view, again, as stated, says nothing about what sorts of things C and E have to be. It just says that the understanding of causation depends on our understanding whether one thing would have happened if the other had happened, basically. So the counterfactual dependence understanding of causation also doesn't have that same traditional interactionist dualism problem about explaining mental to physical causation. Now, Kim expands on this problem for substance dualism, and he calls this the pairing problem in some of his work. On Kim's updated problem of interaction, the substance dualist can't explain how or why one immaterial mind rather than another counts as engaging in some particular causal interaction with the physical. So basically the question is, all right, so let's suppose that this non-extended ectoplasm stuff, this mind substance that's a purely thinking thing, causes my body to act for some reason. Maybe you have a Humane regularity theory, maybe you have a counterfactual dependence theory, or any other thing. But why is it the case that if this mind isn't located anywhere, it affects this body located here and not any other body? And in fact, why is it the case that that mind can only affect this body and seems unable to affect any other body? Kim suggests that the substance dualist can't explain why that is the case, why one immaterial mind rather than any other one counts as engaging in some particular causal interaction. So what is clear is that if we had spatial relations, we would be able to solve this problem. But we can't use spatial relations because according to at least the Cartesian dualist, minds are unextended. They don't exist in a location. They don't have spatial relations. Humane causation, Kim points out, also doesn't solve this problem because constant conjunction may be insufficient to explain why one mind is linked to one particular body. Constant conjunction says that in general, say when I have a volition, I act on it or something like that. But what makes the mind that causes this body to act my mind? Why is it that when one sort of volition occurs, because remember, volitions aren't going to be located in space on the Cartesian theory, why is it that this body moves? Over 7 billion people that exist in the world. Why do I move and not someone else over there? In fact, people do sometimes move over there when I have a random volition. And it might turn out that I only ever move when some other people do, but it's a sheer coincidence. But the Humean can't seem to explain why it is the case that my volition is linked to my body, because my mind wouldn't be, again, located in a space. Now, the philosopher Karen Bennett points out that the problem that Kim outlines for substance dualism and that Princess Elizabeth had outlined for interactionism also arises in the physical domain. Consider two particles. Suppose these two particles are indiscernible. They're physically indiscernible. You couldn't tell them apart. Call them particle A and particle B. And suppose now also that particle A and particle B are the only two particles that exist in a particular universe, the only two things that exist. Suppose each undergoes a process that has a 50% chance of generating a daughter particle. Now, suddenly, one additional particle, appears equidistant from both A and B. Call this particle C. Which of the two particles caused it? As far as our theories of causation are concerned, there's no straight answer. We wouldn't know which particle produced this daughter particle. We wouldn't be able to say that one caused it. We might have to say that like both caused it or something. But that feels wrong because only one of them is necessary for explaining why particle C exists, but we can't identify which one it is, even though it's an abstract thought experiment and we could just decide it's A. But like there's no in principle reason for choosing A over B. Now here's a second kind of example. Consider a lump of clay and the statue that is made up of that lump of clay. Call the lump of clay Lumple, and the statue that's made of the clay, Goliath. This is an old example in philosophy. So if Lumpel fell on my foot and Goliath fell on my foot, which of course would happen because Goliath is made of Lumpel, right? Which of those two events caused my toe to break? If Lumpel fell on my foot and Goliath fell on my foot, which caused it? We can't say that just one caused it or just the other caused it, because there's no good reason to prefer one explanation over the other explanation. But it's not the case that two events caused my toe to break, even though the event of Goliath falling on my foot and Lumpel falling on my foot can be described as different events. It feels like there's a pairing problem there as well. Now, we might imagine that the dualist can just say, the pairing relation is primitive. The thing that connects my mind to my body is a primitive fact. There's nothing further to say about it. It's a little bit like saying causation is primitive. It's just a kind of relationship that can exist in the world. We can't give an explanation of it. We just know when it happens. Bennett actually likes this response, and many people actually hold this view. The only thing then that Kim's pairing problem shows is that Cartesians are anti-reductionists about causation. They don't want to say that causation is primitive. So Bennett thinks that Kim is resisting putting these causal relationships as basic existences in the universe. Now, I'm going to problematize that in a minute, but before I do that, this has just kind of been an aside on the traditional problem of interaction for the substance dualist. And we've imagined now some responses to the charges that Elizabeth of Bohemia had launched against Descartes. It is possible, maybe, to resolve the interactionist problem using the metaphysics of causation. Now, one thing that is going to become clear is that Kim actually thinks that this problem of mental causation isn't only a problem if you're a dualist. So the problem of mental causation is going to turn out to be a problem for the non-reductive physicalist as well. And guess who is a non-reductive physicalist? Functionalists. Most functionalists understand themselves to be non-reductive physicalists. They think that mental properties or mental events cannot be reduced to physical properties or physical events. It's a little bit like saying Goliath and Lumpel are two different things. Of course, they occupy the same space, but because we describe them in different ways, Goliath is a statue, Lumpel is clay. Goliath has different persistence conditions from Lumpel. Like I could squish Goliath, Lumpel would still be there, Goliath would be gone, right? They have different extensions in space-time, so they're different events, we want to say. A similar thing is a thing that the non-reductive physicalist wants to say about mental events. You can sometimes not have beliefs or desires or consciousness, even though the physical substances would continue to exist, right? The mental properties and mental events emerge from, or they're supervenient on, the physical events and properties. So they're distinct. That's the view of the non-reductive physicalist, like the functionalist. Kim is going to show that this problem of mental causation is a concern for them as well. And my job for the rest of the lecture today is to kind of walk us through what that problem is. So Kim's argument for this problem for non-reductive physicalism actually stems from one major principle that we've talked about a lot that is kind of a basic principle for a lot of physicalists. And that principle is the principle of causal closure of the physical. And that principle says, if a physical event has a cause that's occurring, for example, a cause occurring at time t, then it has a sufficient physical cause at time t. This principle suggests, Kim tells us, that the physical domain is causally and explanatorily self-sufficient. It also does still allow, he points out, for uncaused events. But if there's a physical event and that physical event has a cause, it's got to have a physical cause. That's what physical causal closure says, according to Kim. So this principle, as stated, allows for uncaused events. It's not the same thing as causal determinism. It just thinks that the physical causal domain has to be closed to outside influence, basically. That's why it's called causal closure. If there are going to be non-physical events happening, they've got to be in their own place, like over there. Thirdly, this principle is consistent with mind-body dualism, actually, if you think about it, right? Because as long as the mental has its own restricted causal domain, like mental events can affect other mental events, they can ping around over here, as long as they don't try to like contaminate the physical events over here, we're good. The only thing that it doesn't accept is interactionism, where the mental events are going to go and hop in over here and mess everything up, because causal closure says if any physical event occurs with a cause, it's going to occur because of a sufficient physical cause. There's going to be some other physical event that sufficiently explains that physical thing happening. So that principle, physical causal closure, is a thing that Kim uses to problematize causation for non-reductive physicalism. And this argument he produces is called the argument from exclusion. And it goes like this. So first of all, here's this further principle, which you might find plausible. It's called the exclusion principle. The exclusion principle says that no event has two or more distinct sufficient causes all occurring at the same time, unless it's a genuine case of overdetermination. So any event that occurs doesn't really have more than two sufficient causes that are occurring at the same time, unless it's genuinely overdetermined. So most of the time we want to say that any event has one sufficient cause. And that might require like bundling a couple of things that happen together, any single one of which wouldn't have been sufficient, but maybe them together make for sufficient cause, right? But you don't usually say that two things were sufficient for the event happening unless we say that it was overdetermined. That's all that exclusion says. It's either overdetermined or it's not. In the normal case, it's not overdetermined, right? Okay, so here's the argument. Premise one, suppose we accept physical causal closure, which we would if we're physicalists, like most functionalists are, right? we are inclined to accept physical causal closure. Premise two, now suppose that a mental event, call it M, at a particular time t, the event of my being thirsty. Suppose that event causes a physical event P over here, such as my drinking water. So suppose my being thirsty causes my drinking water, M and P. Premise three, from premise one, physical causal closure, there must be a physical event P star at T at the same time that M happens, which is a sufficient cause of P. So there's got to be some physical event that sufficiently explains why I'm drinking water, because my drinking water is a physical event. And if we accept causal closure, then this event must have a sufficient physical cause. If it has any causes, it must have a sufficient physical cause. So there must be some physical event P star, maybe the realization base of the event of my being thirsty, right? M, my being thirsty, must have maybe a P star, like a brain event that sufficiently explains my drinking water. So given that, either it's got to be the case that my being thirsty is the same as whatever physical event is explaining the drinking water. If mental states are equivalent to brain states, then we're good. There's no problem. So either that's true or overdetermination is true. Either it's true that M and P star are identical, or it's got to be a genuine case where there's two things that are sufficient explanations of this thing happening, my drinking water. So Kim says, if overdetermination is true, if there's both a mental event and a physical event that are sufficient for explaining my drinking water, it just looks like epiphenomenalism is true. Remember when we talked about epiphenomenalism? Epiphenomenalism says that mental events have no causal powers. If overdetermination is true, then for any occasion that I can think of a mental event supposedly causing a physical event, there's an even better physical event that explains it sufficiently well. So, like, the mental event is just kind of there superfluously, it's not doing any work. And what is that if not epiphenomenalism? So, Kim goes on to add that if we want both of those things to be false, if we want it to be the case both that psychophysical identity theory is false and that overdetermination is false for this case, then it has to be the case that M, my being thirsty, is not actually a cause of P. So physical causal closure gets us in trouble. But why would we reject physical causal closure? That was one of the most appealing things about being a physicalist, is that you could hope that every single event that occurred, you would have an expected explanation in physical terms of that event, a causal physical explanation. So we don't want to give up causal closure. So instead, what we should give up is that M is a cause of P, that my being thirsty causes my drinking water. So, conclusion of the argument, it follows that mental events never cause physical events. If we are holding in mind that we want to make it possible for mental events to be different from physical events, but maybe supervenient on them or whatever, we get in trouble. So Kim's exclusion argument is an argument that destroys, if he's right, the possibility of non-reductive physicalism. Because any time that you have a mental event that is better explained for its causal effects by whatever physical events are happening, then the mental events just seem superfluous. They're epiphenomenal. So anytime that we try to be non-reductive physicalists, we, end up being epiphenomenalists on Kim's view. So the argument says either accept reductive physicalism, like the psychoneural identity theory, or face the specter of epiphenomenalism. Now, obviously, Kim's exclusion argument has not gone uncontested, and in our next lecture, I will talk about that, the set of responses that people have given to the exclusion problem. But before we get into that, I'm going to mention one other argument that Kim makes that makes trouble for non-reductive physicalists. So this argument he calls the argument from supervenience. And remember, mind-body supervenience is when we have some mental event depend on or covary with some physical event. More specifically, when a mental property M is instantiated by something, call it X, at a particular time, T, supervenience says that it is in virtue of the fact that X instantiates at T a physical property P, such that anything that has P at any time necessarily has M at the same time. So mind-body supervenience says that when there is a mental property instantiated by something, it's because that something instantiates a physical property. So the mental property is there because there's a physical property there. But like basically you only ever get mental events if there are physical events, or you only get mental properties if there are physical properties. That's supervenience. And that's one of the reasons why sometimes supervenience is understood as minimal physicalism. Okay, so with that supervenience recap, here's the argument from supervenience. Premise 1, suppose that a mental event, M, causes another mental event, M star. Like suppose that my imagining ice cream causes me to want ice cream. So imagining ice cream is event M, desiring ice cream is event M star. According to mind-body supervenience, M star, my wanting ice cream, is instantiated in virtue of some physical event, P star, being instantiated. So my wanting ice cream is instantiated by like a brain state or something, or a functional state of my physical system. If I'm having some desire for ice cream, it's better be explained by the fact that something physical is going on. Call that physical going on P star. So M star is instantiated because A, an instance of M, my imagining ice cream, caused M star, my desiring ice cream, to instantiate, and B, a supervenience space of M star, my desiring ice cream, was instantiated P star. So M is instantiated, my wanting ice cream is instantiating both because I'm imagining ice cream and because there's a physical going on. So these claims, these two different claims, can be reconciled, says Kim, if we accept that M, my imagining ice cream, caused my desiring ice cream, M star, by causing P star. So if my imagining causes the physical stuff, then we can make sense of how both my imagining and the physical stuff instantiates my desiring ice cream. But if we accept that, if we say that my imagining ice cream is the cause of the physical going on, then we're saying that my imagining is causing a physical event. So Kim is saying that mental to mental causation, if we assume mind body supervenience, leads to mental to physical causation. So basically, if anything has causal powers, it must be part of the physical domain. So this argument again shows that, ironically, even though we started with just a very innocent mental to mental causation, imagining to desire, right? It got us to realizing that the physical domain is a very powerful explanatory tool, which is there in the background if we're assuming supervenience is true, and explaining why mental events happen, because it always requires some instantiation of a physical event. All of this mental stuff happening must be happening in the physical causal domain. So what's ultimately going to happen, and this is sort of off screen if you like, is that physical causation is just going to swamp mental causation. Why even bother talking about mental causation if at every juncture you're going to end up having to talk about physical causation? It's just going to look like the argument from supervenience pulls you toward the argument from exclusion, and now mental events, even mental to mental events, kind of float away. We're being led toward epiphenomenalism, unless, Kim thinks, we accept mind-brain identity or psychophysical identity theory. So Kim thinks non-reductive physicalism is in trouble. He thinks that non-reductive physicalism is just as bad as dualism. It's just as problematic to explain physical goings on if you think that mental properties are not the same as physical properties. If you think that mental properties are different from physical properties, you get in trouble. And the only way out is going to be to say that actually mental properties turn out to be the same as physical properties. La-di-da, kumbaya, we're all good. But if you're a functionalist, you have all kinds of reasons not to want to say that, because functionalism as a kind of non-reductive physicalism is attractive because it allows that maybe mental properties can be instantiated by many kinds of physical properties. Maybe, you can have a mind made of silicone or of neurons or of some undiscovered Martian goop, right? Like, we have not thought of all of the ways to build something with mentality according to the functionalist, because mental properties are multiply realizable. But if Kim's argument from exclusion and from supervenience makes sense, then it's just going to have to be the case that those mental properties aren't doing any work in the physical domain. And it's also going to turn out that if the mental properties aren't doing any work, then we also can't talk about agency. We can't talk about agents. We can't talk about reasoning and rationality being an explanation for anything that we do. All of the explanations are going to turn out to be erased in favor of physical explanations, reductive explanations. So what do we do? If we want to be non-reductive physicalists, how do we respond to Kim? And do you think it's right to say that the problems for the substance dualist look very similar now to the problems for the non-reductive physicalist, the functionalist, or the property dualist? Are we stuck with epiphenomenalism? Yes or no? What do you think? Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope to talk to you soon. Bye.